Welcome back. The Christian path of faith has met many challenges, and not always gracefully. It eventually came to terms with the new cosmology of Galileo, the new biology of Darwin, and the explanations for human behaviour that depend on acknowledging a subconscious self. But until very recently, it's been very standoffish about other paths of faith. But we see signs of some accommodations, and though it seems strange at first, Buddhism is one such accommodation that's proving to be quite congenial. Stephen, what does Buddhism have to say to Christianity?
I think perhaps what Buddhism offers to Christians, let's say,
Yes.
is a form of spiritual practice that I think may have existed in earlier times in the Christian church, particularly, say, in monastic traditions. A form of practice that actually has to do with working on the very nature of the quality of your consciousness. And this, I feel, is both effective. It's something that you can try it out and see if it works. But I think it, particularly in a busy, frenetic, secular world like our own, it actually offers the possibility of a quality of mind, a stillness, a clarity, an awareness that can be an enormous resource in actually learning to be in this world without being driven by it.
Okay, so Christians could end up being better Christians by taking on board some Buddhist practices.
Well, that would not be really for me to say, but certainly I feel Buddhism would be able to offer that as something that would not in any way require that such a person should become a Buddhist.
So it's not an either-or thing.
No, not at all.
But I think in general what Buddhism has to offer is more in common with humanism, I think. That'd be a human-centred view rather than a heaven or divine-centred view of human nature.
I think that's true. I mean, see, the Buddha never had any reason to use a term over 40 years of teaching that we would translate as God. And many Christians or people who are struggling with Christianity find it in a way liberating to be able to find a spiritual language, a deeply felt religious language, one that offers complex philosophical and psychological ideas, and yet needs pay no reference whatsoever to a divine power, a saviour out there in any way, but puts the onus once again on the challenge to live one's life in a full and authentic manner.
So it's saying you own your life and you've got to run it. You can't depend on somebody, some external agent, some divine agent doing calling the shots for you.
Well, different Buddhist schools have different views on that, but in the early tradition that I would feel most at home in, yes, it's very much about finding your own self-reliance, that putting into practice the teachings in your own life that make a difference that you can then notice. It's not entirely just about me doing my thing. Buddhism also emphasizes the importance of that taking place within a communal setting. We need friendships, we need the support of a community, we need people with whom to discuss and argue around these things. So it is a social thing, but the actual praxis in many ways starts with a transformation within oneself.
But it is feet on the ground, earthbound.
Yes, indeed, absolutely.
So there might be some Christian traditions that might find it not heavenly orientated enough, not divinely orientated enough.
Yes. Well, for example, there are many Roman Catholics, Jesuits and priests and so forth who have trained as Zen monks in Japan and now teach Zen retreats in their monasteries.
And they don't see that as compromising their Christian position.
Well, the Vatican does.
Yes,
But they don't.
Okay.
I mean, there's a struggle within the church around this. But no, they see actually Buddhist meditation as being able to bring one to the state of calm and stillness within which one can then turn to Christ in a fuller and deeper way.
Okay, right. So but in confronting the West, Buddhism has a patchy record, I think, in dealing with modernity. But now the West itself has gone soft on modernism. It's going postmodernist. Ironically, Buddhism, a system built on impermanence, seems to have got there first. so has Buddhism, as it were, figured out that postmodernism was coming and arrived there first?
Well, Buddhism certainly has always had a suspicion of ideology, a suspicion of orthodoxy, a recognition that as soon as you try to congeal anything into a fixed and final theory, you are liable to actually start missing the very point of what that theory was meant to address. So Buddhism's emphasis on impermanence, on contingency, on emptiness, almost seems tailor-made to fit a kind of postmodern discourse.
Yeah, so that as the as postmodernism catches on in the West, and as the certainties from the 18th to the 20th century, as those are shown to be not as certain as we thought they were, then Buddhism may have a lot more to say to a lot more people.
I think it does, but of course Buddhism is also caught in a strange kind of catch-22 itself. In other words, that Buddhism proclaims impermanence and contingency and emptiness for everything, but often not Buddhism itself.
Okay.
Buddhists are reluctant to apply those qualities to Buddhism, to their tradition. They're often very convinced that this is in fact the final and the ultimate reading and interpretation of the world.
I think postmodernists suffer the same problem too, that they're accused of setting up the same kind of system that they're trying to pull down.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Does Buddhism implicitly disapprove of much of what's characteristic of the West? I was thinking of our frenetic activity, our jealous concern for the rights of the individual, Declaration of Human Rights and so on, our acquisition of assets and so on. It seems to me that Buddhism has an implicit criticism of that.
Buddhism is concerned primarily with making us see the consequences of acting in a selfish, unkind way, both to ourselves and to others. And I think acquisitiveness, believing that you can somehow find meaning in life just through the possession of things, believing that somehow you can only get what you want by expending huge amounts of energy frenetically running around. These are points the Buddha critiqued 2,500 years ago. But other aspects, I feel, for example, human rights, the value of the individual, this is something I think Buddhism needs to take on board. Buddhism, if anything, does not have a particularly good record in terms of, say, social equality, social justice, and all of these things. And this, I think, is where Buddhism can learn from.
I think if we want to crow about the West, I mean, you can talk about its material gains, and perhaps some of those are problematic, but you can talk about the development of human rights, which is a peculiarly Western thing from, the Enlightenment onwards. But does the centrality of the conscious thinking individual, does that conflict with the not-self doctrine of Buddhism?
It might appear to do so. I don't in fact feel that it does. I think the idea of non-self in Buddhism is taken too literally, and it fails to acknowledge that the person, the individual, is the one who experiences this non-self. There is always someone there to have that experience.
All right. Yeah.
And so, but Buddhism perhaps has been too biased towards its non-self and has not developed a coherent and, I think, credible theory of what in fact the nature of the processual, ongoing, contingent self is.
So, so the West can claim a lot of credit for the promotion of the individual, and that is one of the things that you'd like to see in reforming Buddhism.
I would like Buddhism to become more individuated. In other words, for the practice of Buddhism to be something that's more about each person taking responsibility for themselves, utilizing methods and practices within Buddhism to advance that, and somehow then creating a life of their own, and ultimately perhaps also taking their practice into the creation of a world, of a society, of a community, to take more of that on board oneself rather than feel that some monks or priests or whatever have responsibility there.
Looking back over where we've gone so far and a lot of the things that you've written, I get the impression that we can take something like religious clothing as an example, that there are now many religious groups, Western and Eastern, so, that are wearing garments that were the garments of the day. I'm thinking of the Amish in the United States who still go around wearing 16th century clothing. That seems to be a good metaphor for accidental historical things that get swept into a cultural stream and then set in concrete in that stream. And I think you see a lot of the reforms that Buddhism would profit by as being removal of things like that.
No, indeed. I think there's a lot of Buddhism, people who are drawn to Buddhism are often attracted by the exoticism of certain aspects of Oriental culture. So if they become Tibetan Buddhists, then they start wearing Tibetan robes and carrying Tibetan artifacts around and so forth, as though that was somehow Buddhist. But this, I think, is not the case.
So these are the cultural accidents that have got sort of swept into the
Absolutely.
stream. The saying is that the Buddha set the wheel of Dharma in motion and taught the causes and cessation of anguish. That's, if you like, the central, if you like, my creedal statement. Is that an end in itself? Having figured out what causes the anguish and then got rid of it, are you home and hosed, or then does that set you off to do more things from that point onwards?
No, I mean, in classical Buddhism, the understanding is that when one reaches a point where one momentarily, perhaps, experiences the stopping of that craving, the stopping of that attachment, a kind of emptiness, if you wish, that is not the end of the path, but that is actually the beginning. In other words, it's from that renewed sense of one's own being, not one that's fixed into a tight nugget of ego, but one that is open and expansive, an awareness of the transitory nature of things, that one then has a new ground from which to act.
Okay. And then you go out into the world refreshed and renewed and...
Yes, that is how I see it. The meditation and so forth is about opening oneself up in a way that one can learn to respond to situations in a new fashion, rather than just reacting to them as one's conditioning may predispose one.
We're going to start bringing things to a close this time. Thank you very much, Stephen Batchelor, for being on Capital Talk. Thank you.
Noel.
Well, that's the program for this week. I have been in conversation with Stephen Batchelor, a Buddhist and a former Buddhist monk. Our thanks to Canterbury Television for the use of their recording studios. Come back at this time next week for another edition of Capital Talk, which we subtitled, for reasons that we hope our viewers find obvious, Current Affairs Television for Grown-Ups. I'm Noel. Good night.